Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Manikaran Singh Chakkar, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all to the ICS Wednesday seminar titled Haunting of a Repressed Past, Yu Hua's Avant-Garde Works in the 1980s. This seminar examines the role of memory and history in contemporary Chinese literature, particularly in the period following the Cultural Revolution. It focuses on the emergence of avant-garde fiction in the 1980s as a significant literary movement through which writers sought to confront and articulate the traumas of the past. The discussion will center on Yu Hua, a prominent figure of this movement who made his breakthrough with the avant-garde short story On the Road at Age 18, published in 1987. The presentation will explore how the narrative engages with themes of memory, historical consciousness, and trauma in the context of post-revolutionary China through a prose reading of Yu Hua's short story, 1986. The speaker for today's seminar is Ms. Tanvi Negi. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Chinese Studies, School of Languages, Doon University, Uttarakhand. She is currently pursuing her PhD from the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She was the recipient of the 2023 Institute of Chinese Studies Harvard Yinching Institute Doctorate Fellowship for China Studies. She has translated a Chinese novel, Luo To Shangzi, that is The Rickshaw Boy by Lao Shi, from Chinese to Hindi, published by the National Book Trust in 2019 as Rikshawala. Her research interests include Chinese language and culture, teaching of Chinese as a foreign language, modern and contemporary Chinese literature, translation studies, and memory studies. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Manjurani Hara. Dr. Hara is an associate professor in the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, School of Language, Literature, and Culture Studies, Jawaharlal University. Her doctoral thesis focused on literary activism in China in the 1980s and 1990s. Her research interests include modern and contemporary Chinese literature, Chinese society and culture, gender relations, and Chinese media. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All the participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Hara. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manikaran. Before I start, I would like to inform that this seminar is a part of the series which features the recipients of ICS HYI Multi-Year Doctoral Fellowship in China Studies. And perhaps many of you are aware that Tanvi herself was one of them. So thank you all of you. And I thank ICS for giving me this opportunity to come and listen to Tanvi once again. In several occasions, I have heard Tanvi and exchanged our impressions at several places about Chinese contemporary literature. And she has always been very interested in addressing memory, and she eventually went on to pursue memory studies. And in terms of her work, today what she will be discussing is she will be discussing Yu Hua's one of the avant-garde work, 1986, a short story. But before we jump to Yu Hua, let me just, though I think Tanvi has been introduced, but Tanvi is an associate professor in the Doon University Chinese Center, and she was awarded ICS HYI Doctoral Fellowship in 2023, I think. And as a result of that, she was both in Shanghai and in Harvard at two different times. Today, she will be discussing contemporary Chinese literature and specifically Yu Hua's one particular work, 1986, which is one of the very important and very famous work of Yu Hua, though most of us know Yu Hua by the works like To Live, Water, which is one of the most famous works of him. But she's specifically looking into avant-garde literature, wherein that after the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, there were many writers that had used their literary creativity and their writings to reflect on China's recent or contemporary past. And through these works, they were actually getting into the traumatic history, traumatic past, and trying to recount their experiences through these personal memories. So Tanvi will once again be looking in part through this story at the history and the trauma that Cultural Revolution had given to many people, and how these people deal with the memory of such trauma. The avant-garde as a literary trend was somewhat short-lived. But it was arguably one of the most significant literary movements in the 1980s China, which is the post-Cultural Revolution China. And for avant-garde also, I was looking at it that there were many terms actually, which is Linglei, and which kind of translates to offbeat or alternative, something which is unconventional. And then there is another Qianwei, which I think comes quite literally from the translation or the very understanding of the word avant-garde, which means of advanced garde. So Qianwei is another term, but I think the most accepted term that I had seen for avant-garde, and then we can perhaps again confirm this, is Xianfeng Wenxue, right? In literature, this term actually refers to where literature and art challenges the traditional norms, and it kind of establishes more experimental approaches to the narrative or to the process of storytelling. And in various narratives, writers have been trying to push their boundaries with very unconventional structures and style and content, and Yu Hua being one of them. This movement kind of lasted in China roughly from 1985 to 1989. But during these 4 or 5 years, avant-garde literary movement, this literary trend really flourished, and there were many writers. There were writers that were actually writing across different trends. Yu Hua is regarded as one of the most promising avant-garde writer. He's also known as a post-new wave writer. So a lot of these things I think Tanvi is going to touch upon today. And there are many critics that also regard him as a champion of postmodernist writing. So there is a bit of postmodernism that Tanvi is going to discuss in today's talk as well. So I think maybe without further ado, with further delay, I can ask Tanvi to start discussing her work. Over to you, Tanvi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hara, for this kind introduction and for laying the background, sorry, let's say the foreground for my talk today, and for chairing the session today. I would also like to thank the ICS for this opportunity to present my work here. I want to thank everyone here today in the audience for attending this talk on this hot summer day. My presentation today is a work in progress, and I invite many suggestions of feedback to improve it. And of course, I'm very happy to answer any questions as best as I can. So here we go. The title of my presentation today is Haunting of a Repressed Past, Yu Hua's Avant-Garde Works in the 1980s. So let's begin. Kindly to the next slide. Thank you. Chinese literature in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976, underwent a profound transformation, marked by an intense preoccupation with memory and history. The unrelenting political campaigns initiated by the Chinese state since the founding of the PRC in 1949 had left deep scars on the collective consciousness of the nation, and the literary field responded to it by engaging in what can be termed as a project of cultural reckoning. This post-1976 literary production, aptly termed New Era literature, signified not merely a temporal shift, but an epistemic rupture from Maoist ideological constraints. It heralded a new epoch defined by economic growth, modernization, national reconstruction, liberalization of the cultural and intellectual space, and increased engagement with the outside world. The literary renaissance of the 1980s was facilitated in part by a large influx of Western literary works, literary theories, and literary trends, which created an environment of intellectual and cultural ferment symbolized in the culture fever, the one horror of the 1980s. This created a fertile ground for stylistic and thematic experimentation in literature. Writers who had been silenced during earlier decades due to political persecution emerged on the literary scene, while a new cohort born and raised under Mao's regime, the so-called Mao's children, began to articulate their own narratives, shaped by revolutionary indoctrination and subsequent disillusionment. Hong Chang identifies a bifurcation within the literary output of the 1980s, and he identifies 1985 as the dividing line. So the first half of the decade was primarily concerned with memorializing the Cultural Revolution, which had been officially denounced as 10 years of chaos. Freed from the rigid ideological oversight of the Mao state, literature became a critical medium through which the writers could engage in testimonial acts, inscribing their suffering and trauma onto the national consciousness. Seminal works such as You Have No Other Choice by Yu Hua, Transparent Adishes by Mo Yan, Xiao Bao Chuang by Wang Ye, Pa 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 by Han Xiaokong, and Qi Wang by Atong heralded the emergence of distinct literary trends such as rule-taking literature and modernist literature. Next slide, please. Now, within the literary landscape of the 1980s, memory writing emerged as a key mode of engagement with the past. Three types of memory writing can be identified in the 1980s, which is undertaken by three different sets of writers. The first set of writers is the re-emergent or the returnee writers, such as Wang Meng, Zhang Xianyang, Lu Wenfu, and Gao Xiaosheng, who re-entered the literary sphere after decades of forced silence, possessing deep ideological commitments and shaped by the traumas of anti-racist campaign and the Cultural Revolution. These authors viewed literature as a vehicle for historical testimony and moral responsibility. The second category comprises of the educated youth, the Chiqing writers, often referred to as the lost generation or Mao's children. Although they shared with the returnees a background of ideological formation and had lived experience of hardships, they had lost faith in the very ideology that had informed their whole lives. Also different was their reception in the mainstream society, which, while the re-emergent writers had previously accumulated cultural capital and returned to the literary scene, vindicated and rehabilitated, the educated youth was met with ambivalence in the social and cultural sphere. Their memory work focuses on memories of the experiences as educated youth when they were sent to the countryside. The third group includes the avant-garde writers born in the late 1950s and early 1960s, barring a few. Now, these individuals, whom Chen Xiaoming has called latecomers to life, Wan Shankai, they matured during the post-Mao era and benefited from the reforms of the Tang period. Though they had limited direct memory of early traumas such as Great Famine and the anti-racist movement, they nonetheless grappled with the lingering shadows of ideological violence. Their literature is characterized by formal innovation and existential alienation, reflecting their marginal position within dominant cultural discourses. Next slide, please. Now, I look at the avant-garde fiction in China. So in the autumn of 1987, the prestigious literary journal Harvest, Shoko, featured a collection of unconventional narratives by a group of relatively unknown writers at that time in its fifth issue. This special edition would later be recognized as a foundational moment of avant-garde literature in China. These works were radically different from anything being written at that time. And as Yu Hua remarks, the editors of other journals remarked in private that Harvest was making mischief, referring both to the work's narrative form and the political risk they were taking. Nevertheless, the journal continued to publish the works of writers such as Ma Yuan, Su Tong, Ke Fei, Ye Chaoyan, Sun Kanlu, Hong Kong, and Yu Hua in the subsequent issues as well. And they collectively came to define the avant-garde movement in China. Now, these texts were alternately categorized as experimental fiction, Shi and Xiaoshuo, metafiction, or new wave fiction, and they bore the clear imprint of modernist and postmodernist Western literary influences, particularly the works of Borges, Kafka, and Rob Riley. Thematically and formally, avant-garde fiction foregrounded the artificiality of narrative construction, interrogated the stability of language, and rejected the transparency of historical truth. This literary tendency represented not merely aesthetic innovation, but a philosophical and epistemological challenge to the dominant modes of representation. The rise of avant-garde literature coincided with a broader moment of socio-political transition in China. The 1980s were marked by the shift from a revolutionary society governed by Maoist ideology to a post-revolutionary reform-era state characterized by an emergent market economy and intensified globalization. The implementation of Deng Xiaoping's policy of reform and opening up engendered a relative loosening of ideological control over the cultural sphere. Now, this facilitated an open discursive space for artistic and creative freedom, intellectual discussion, and desire to enter the global cultural market. However, these reforms also produced deep structural contradictions, rising corruption, social inequality, and a pervasive sense of ideological disorientation. The ideal of national rejuvenation gave way to widespread disenchantment, culminating in the political rupture of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. Now, in this volatile context, the younger writers soon realized that China's changing reality was beyond their comprehension, and the discursive tools at their disposal were insufficient to make sense of their complex and complicated modern experiences. The critical reception of avant-garde fiction, as Dr. Hara also mentioned, was intensely polarized. So the advocates celebrated it as evidence of Chinese literature's entry into the global literary arena, praising its linguistic experimentation and formal innovation. Scholar Ernie Schweiger has argued that the hallmark of avant-garde literature is its radical contemporaneity, its capacity to articulate the disjointed temporalities and contradictions of the post-revolutionary moment. Others, like Shopping Tang, have employed the concept of residual modernism to frame avant-garde writing as a site where unresolved modernist impulses coexist with post-modern aesthetics. Scholars such as Yi Heng Chao emphasize the metafictional character of these texts, while Tsai Yung-chun suggests that avant-garde authors deploy linguistic estrangement as a tool for both ideological subversion and literary pleasure. History in avant-garde works is never overtly referred, but critics have argued for a very strong influence of the cultural evolution on these works. For example, Shantanu Fei contends that avant-garde narratives abandon overt political judgment in favor of fragmented, experiential accounts of the past, turning the cultural evolution into just a narrative element. Avant-garde literature had as many opponents as supporters, where the main criticism of avant-garde literature was its refusal to take a stand on real social issues and for being obtuse. So critics such as Liu Kang have noted its paradoxical nature. It's radical in form, but politically disengaged. Others, like Liu Fusheng, dismiss the genre as overvalued, a literary myth advanced by self-interested culture elites, and even going so far as to say that avant-garde literature consists of mostly mystical ravings of a group of pretentious young cultural elites. Lu Thonglin offered a feminist critique, and in her book, she suggests that in rejecting dominant narratives, some avant-garde texts have inadvertently reproduced misogynistic discourses. Now, the multiple and diverse assessments of Chinese avant-garde works ensured its lasting legacy. Even though it had a short life, it had a lasting impact on contemporary Chinese literature. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, next slide, sorry. Yeah, so now we come to Yu Hua and his avant-garde works. And I'll try and locate Yu Hua in the avant-garde literature, fiction, basically in Chinese contemporary literature. So Yu Hua, as we all know, was born in 1960 in a small town of Haiyan in Zhejiang province. He began writing in early 1980s, but he became popular overnight with the publication of his short story, his first avant-garde short story, On the Road at age 18, 十八岁出门远行, in 1987. He went on to publish his first set of stories between the years 1987 and 1989, which includes, but is not limited to, stories like The Event on 3rd April, 1986, Worldly Things Are Like Mist, One Kind of Reality, In Memory of Miss Willow Young, Kutia Aiching, and Past and Punishments, and many more. In the words of Yi Heng Chao, Yu Hua had almost no period of apprenticeship. And when he began writing, he already had all the marks of a writer of an excellent caliber. Yu Hua's avant-garde writing. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, Yu Hua's avant-garde writing is varied in its style and plot structure. The narration is undertaken in a cool and detached manner without any moral evaluations or judgments. The narrative voice is mostly polyphonic and unreliable. The narrative structure is non-linear and fragmented, and the graphic descriptions of violence and death. In his early journey of literary writing, he was heavily influenced by Japanese writer Kawabata Yasunari. But an important turn in his writing occurred in the year 1986 when he accidentally encountered Kafka at a bookstore in his hometown. He reminisces how his friend first set eyes on Kafka and he begged his friend to exchange it with his Tolstoy's War and Peace. It was this fateful meeting with Kafka that changed Yu Hua's literary course and his life forever. Kafka opened another world to him. And he says, and I quote, Kawabata taught me how to describe, but Kafka taught me how to write. Kafka did not just influence his writing, but also transformed his worldview. And he says, he brought me freedom of writing. This freedom was freedom from expectations of what literature should be, that had confined Chinese writers to a realist mode of writing and conventional linguistic patterns. It was in Kafka's world that Yu Hua found and the courage to forge his own individual literary voice. Yu Hua's avant-garde works engage deeply with traumatic memory of the past and describing recent Chinese history. His works display many postmodern characteristics with this rejection of grand narratives, heterogeneity of form, emergence of subjectivity, intertextuality, self-parodying, negation of absolute truth, constructive nature of reality, and historical rupture. Liu Xu, in his book, he regards Yu Hua's avant-garde works to be postmodernist for expressing what he calls 不可知论, 世界是不可知的, the unknowability of the world. Now, in the following section, through a close reading of Yu Hua's short story, Avant-Garde short story, 1986, published in the year 1987, I will attempt to analyze the story for its representation of memory, history, and trauma. Now, very briefly, the story is about a history teacher who disappears during the Cultural Revolution and returns to his hometown as a madman on a spring day in 1986. After his arrival into the town, he begins to enact 5 forms of ancient punishments on himself, self-mutilating until he dies in the end. The story also describes the effects that his return has on his wife and daughter and on the people of the town. Thank you. So memory is a critical narrative element in Yu Hua's works. Linda argues that avant-garde writers like Yu Hua, who had not directly experienced the past described, seem captivated by recollecting it. The recent past for them remains an unresolved memory and emerges as an intergenerational trauma, forcing them to confront it and work through it. The fragmented memory that willingly or unwillingly emerges in the story is, as I argue, an absent present. The memory exists in its own very own absence. It's there and yet not there, which is manifested in an incoherent narrative and an unreliable narrator. The world described in 1986 relies on the narration by a third-person omniscient narrator, telling the story with authority. The multiple focalization, however, renders this authority questionable. The story begins in the formulaic mode of many years ago and tells the story of this high school teacher who disappears during the Cultural Revolution after he's dragged from his home by the Red Guards, leaving behind a wife and a 3-year-old daughter. After waiting in vain for many years, the wife remarries and settles down in a new life with her daughter and a new husband. With years, they move on and the past remains a distant memory. Our story begins with the return of this history teacher to the town as a madman, 20 years after the beginning of the Cultural and 10 years after its end. This is a story of the sudden, shocking return of a memory that had been repressed for long, unsettling the present in all its haunting glory. The return of the past is not only symbolized by the return of the madman in town, but simultaneously with the sudden resurfacing of a memory in the wife's consciousness. She had all but forgotten about the history teacher when suddenly is one day confronted by her past and she sees a scrap of yellowing paper with details of forms of ancient punishment among old newspapers at home. This paper was part of her first husband's research on ancient forms of punishment in China that he was obsessed with before he disappeared. This confrontation with this piece of paper forces her to remember her past, the memory of which is so difficult that she screams and faints. 1986 is a story about memory and the inability to deal with it. Whether it is the history teacher or his wife or even his daughter, the struggle to either recover or bury the memories of the past is ever present. The past is not recollected here linearly and chronologically. It erupts in the mind suddenly, bringing with it all sensory experiences. The madman is not someone who has lost all his memories. On the contrary, it is the memories of the past that continue to haunt him. The memories, however, come to him in fragments and flashes, coursing through his mind, stirring his emotions. The narrative shifts temporarily between the past when the history teacher was carried away from his home and the present when he returns. The story is told in the third person, but the narrative focalization is multiple and keeps shifting between the omniscient narrator, the madman, the wife, and the daughter. The readers are made to witness the events through multiple perspectives, where the anxieties and fears of each character is available for the readers to access. Next slide, please. Thank you. Wang Khan and Liu Lin opine that 1986 does not specifically refer to the present 1986. On the contrary, its understanding is more directed to the cultural evolution that broke 20 years ago and 10 years ago. This is a novel about a beginning and an end, or an end, a novel about how it begins and how it ends. The accidental suicide of a madman in 1986 is understood allegorically as a national cultural memory marked by punishment, a national collective memory marked by the cultural revolution, and a modern literary memory with witnessing killings as a background. The senseless violence of the cultural revolution marks the cultural, national, and personal memory of an entire country. The story, with its non-linear fragmented narrative and unreliable and incoherent narrator, use of flashback, destabilizes any efforts on the part of the reader to find an unchallenged truth. The story seems so absurd that it screams its fictitious nature. However, Yu Hua tells us that this image of a madman was not a literary creation. Next slide, please. Or a figment of his imagination, but it's a memory that had left a deep impression on him. He says that after the Cultural Revolution, and I quote, "When I went to Mount Pamir and Leaning Temple in Hangzhou, I could see some people who went insane after being persecuted in the Cultural Revolution. They were still reading Chairman Mao's quotations and shouting slogans like, 'Down with Liu Shaoqi.' I guess they may have spent their whole lives like this, crazy. So I wanted to write about the Cultural Revolution through the eyes of such people. For them, the Cultural Revolution will never pass. Or for the memory of our generation, the Cultural Revolution will never pass." Next slide, please. Thank you. Yu Hua, like his fellow avant-gardists, is concerned with the problematic discourse of history and the issues of its representation. The presentation of history is violent, and that violence is carried out on history. In the story, the brutal assault on history occurs when the history teacher, after going insane, mutilates himself by subjecting his body to the 5 forms of ancient punishment described in the ancient books on penal punishments in China. As a thin line between the past and the present, the personal world and the public realm, body and mind disappears. History turns violent and self-reflexive, turning on itself. Violent history appears in hallucinations and imaginations of the madman, where he sees, and I quote from the text, someone slumped beside a post box, women with feather dusters and toilet seats dangling around their necks, half their hair shaped to make a yin-yang pattern on their scalps, and people in dunce caps and sandwich boards walking on the street, scenes which were very common during the Cultural Revolution. In this story, the teacher / madman and history are linked in a meaningful and dark manner. As Liu Fusheng has astutely deduced that the history teacher is not only linked to his recent past, the modern history of China in Mao's era, but also to China's pre-modern history. While it was his experiences during the Cultural Revolution that led to his madness, the protagonist, or the history teacher, is also deeply inspired by and intimately familiar with the history of penal system in China. This historical connection traces the history of violence in the Cultural Revolution to practices deeply rooted in China's pre-modern past. The violence of history carried out in 3 different historical time periods: ancient China, the Cultural Revolution, and the present day. Now, even though the story takes place in the present 1986, when the history teacher returns, signifying the violent returns of history, he is troubled by his memory of the Cultural Revolution and hallucinates about inflicting the 5 ancient forms of punishment on faceless individuals. The suggestion that the violence carried out during the Cultural Revolution was but a violent return of its past, a 1,000-year-old history of violence deeply rooted in China's feudal past, reminds us of Liu Xun's madman, as who famously bequeaths to Chinese traditional history the title cannibalistic. Next slide, please. Nietzsche famously said, "It is possible to live almost without memory, but it is altogether impossible to live at all without forgetting." The return of the history teacher to the town 10 years after the end of the Cultural Revolution is the return of the past that was perhaps repressed but not forgotten. Zhang Qinghua states that the theme of 1986 is how history is forgotten. 历史是如何被遗忘的. He posits that when the history teacher vanishes during the Cultural Revolution is never heard from again, it signifies that history will remain a mystery. While he represents a traumatic history, his wife and daughter, who have since then moved on, represent the reality. In the story, the history teacher, who is now a madman, enters the town just with the arrival of spring, and this is how it's written in the text. He walked into spring along with the residents of the town, and though they saw him, they paid him little heed. For as soon as he had been noted, his image had already been cast aside and forgotten. This suggests that the urgency of forgetting the past, that is ugly and painful, is strong enough for people to deny something that is right in front of their eyes to the point of apathy. They see the madman, but choose to deny his existence. They are happy in their present with all its commodities and luxuries of modern life, which is represented in the story by romance novels of Choyao and Marlboros and Woodford cigarettes. This suggests that people have settled into the humdrum of a modern life and its comforts. The pain of remembering is too high a cost that no one is willing to pay. While the madman continues to mutilate himself, the people watch with interest, but he soon becomes just a gossip to be passed around the dinner table. Yu Hua seems to be asking what it means to forget our past and what are its ethical implications. As Shopping Punk suggests, the significance of Yu Hua's 1986 lies in the fact that it depicts a peculiar post-catastrophic culture that strains to displace its revolutionary memory and desire by locating gratification, very often an impoverished one, in the realm of consumption and mass culture. He further elaborates that even though the culture evolution and its horrors continue to haunt Yu Hua, but the complacency and apathy of the new consumer culture equally disturbs him. Next slide, please. Thank you. Trauma and its after effects. Now, the representation of trauma in the works of avant-garde writers is carried out through an unrestrained interest in violence and death. This disturbing interest in violence that most avant-garde writers display has been described by David Wang as the familiarization of the uncanny, where literary writing subversively turns the real world into a world where fantastic, absurd, and horrific events take place in an attempt to shake the readers from the existential inertia. Trauma is manifested through disturbing displays of violence in Yu Hua's stories as well, serving as his way of making sense of the existential crisis underlying everyday modern life. Violence is manifested in three planes: physical, psychological, and cultural. The madman in this story manifests the trauma of the past in the most disturbing way. The manic ramblings of the protagonist, a history teacher who turns a madman, as Shopping Yang suggests, is the madness of narration. For the traumatic experiences provoke neurotic symptoms in both the protagonist and the author/narrator of the story. This narrative madness is symptomatic of a deep-seated trauma in the mind of the narrator/author. For example, the following passage from the story: he walked to the river. The water was green and yellow in the sun. He saw a thick band of liquid ooze by. Boats bobbed on its surface like corpses. He noticed the willow trees on the banks of the river. Clumps of hair dangled over the water. This is a tortured mind struggling with an unresolved trauma. Everything around him, even nature, is made something grotesque. The water of the river is green and yellow, resembling pus oozing from a wound that is not cared for or cured. The boats are dead bodies, and the branches of willow trees dangling on the water, mesmerizing scenes so typical of South China, are made into clumps of hair. Anything around him is disfigured into something rotten and decaying and ugly, reflecting the thoughts in his mind. The trauma that he's struggling with is the violence he witnessed and suffered during the Cultural Revolution. Next slide, please. Trauma, as Kathy Carruth explains, is manifested not in its immediate after effect, but in its belatedness and repetition. The effects of trauma of the Cultural Revolution when the history teacher vanished during the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 76 arrives belatedly with the arrival of history teacher to the town as a madman in 1986, 10 years after the end of Cultural Revolution. Fear and anxiety as a psychological manifestation of trauma are evident in the wife of the history teacher. While most studies focus on the madman as the victim, as he self-mutilates in a sadomasochistic manner, I propose that the wife is also a victim of historical violence, similar if not in equal measure to the madman. In the story, the mother and the daughter forget the history teacher, madman, twice to move forward in their lives. They're not seen as victims in the conventional sense, as they represent the present, while the madman represents the past. The callous manner in which the wife returns to her happy, cheerful self the day after the madman kills himself is eerily discomforting. However, I argue it is the coping mechanism that she has adopted to live in the present. While she represses her past, the trauma of the past doesn't lay buried. Living her life happily with her now adult daughter and loving second husband, her past comes to life when she sees the piece of scrap from her ex-husband's research journal. This marks, as we know, the arrival of the madman in the town. Her mental state continues to deteriorate after that, as she confines herself to the house, unwilling to go out, living in perpetual fear of the return of the first husband, which signifies the return of the past and the trauma it signifies. It is in the figure of the wife that one can witness the lingering effects of a trauma on a person's psyche long after the traumatic event has come to pass. Next slide, please. Lingche Reddy-Chun states that a particularly poignant issue concerning writings of collective trauma is silence. Silence manifests in many forms, in forgetting, distortion, absence of confession, and perpetuation of self-censorship. Trauma is processed by people in different ways. While some process it by trying to articulate it in words and other forms, the most significant one is silence. There's always a certain manner of resistance to the processing of trauma because trauma shatters one's sense of self, and sometimes repressing the trauma and maintaining silence about it seems like the only option. Another form of silence is when one witnesses violence and chooses to remain silent. When acts of violence are reduced to a spectacle to be gazed upon and enjoyed for entertainment, it becomes a violent act. The apathy of the silent spectators is manifested permanently in the residents of the town where the madman of the story once lived. He is someone who doesn't belong, who is pushed to the margin of the society. As a madman who is long forgotten, he is not even recognized as a human being. The madman is a spectacle in and of himself by how he looks physically and also how he acts when he continues to mutilate his body in the open view on the street. He is at the same time invisible and hypervisible in society. As a person who doesn't belong to society, he is invisible, but by committing horrific acts of self-mutilation, he is at the same time hypervisible. The people who gather around to watch him with interest very soon forget his existence. The madman's suicide is rendered meaningless as his lifeless dead body is swept away in garbage the next day, with him becoming just a juicy gossip at the dinner table. And I quote from the text: as they talked, the terror began to fade. It was something unusual. They always discussed anything unusual that had happened around town. And when the first topic got stale, they would always move on to something else. That was what they did at the dinner table. That was how they passed the time until they were done. The apathy of modern human beings in this story is a reflection of another kind of violence, the violence of silence. Yu Hua, in one of his essays entitled Xue the Tokien, hypocritical work, writes, in the face of violence and chaos, civilization is merely a symbol, and order becomes a mere decoration. This aptly describes the civilized silence of the modern human being in the face of violence, whether it be of a traumatic memory of the past or its violent representations in the present. Next slide, please. Next slide. In conclusion, Yu Hua's 1986 stands as a poignant literary meditation on memory, history, and trauma. Through a fragmented narrative, unreliable narrator, and visceral imagery, the story captures the haunting return of a repressed past and critiques both societal amnesia and modern apathy. The madman's descent into self-destruction, the wide psychological collapse, and the community's silent gaze all reveal the enduring scars of the cultural revolution. By dismantling conventional narrative and historical discourse, Yu Hua not only exposes the violence of forgetting, but also reclaims literature as a space for bearing witness to the unspeakable collective trauma of China's recent past. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanvi. That was so wonderful to hear you. And there were lots of takeaways, I'm sure, for everyone. As you talked right from the beginning of different kind of writings in the post-reform period, right after the Cultural Revolution, and Avant-Garde being one of them, in which you refer to how Yu Hua was sort of rescued by Kafka, and saying that 他给我带来写的自由, the freedom to write, and the whole buildup of the 5 ancient forms of punishment and its reference to the Lucian's madman, because this was a very natural question in my mind. And I also would want you to probably elaborate more on that. How do you see these two different these two madmen, like how do you see these two madmen are different from each other? Because they are also kind of planted at two different time period, but the memory studies, through your works, I can also see that how it is so very interesting. And there are so many other writers that also have reflected back on the history of the turbulent history of the Cultural Revolution right after the Cultural Revolution when it had ended, right? And the whole memory and a person's inability to deal with it. And thank you for going so much in detail and the thematic analysis of 1986. And explaining that how return, when he returns, during the spring, it is a return of the past, but then it's a past that is not forgotten. So as soon as he's seen, nobody pays any heed to him. So it kind of just once again sort of makes it very clear that how people after a traumatic past have their own ways of coping with a traumatic history. Some people may want to remember too much, and then some are so much in a hurry to cast it aside and forget. And as Professor David Wang Dewey, his Chinese name is fabularization of the uncanny. So I really like that term also, because the more you normalize, a new normal will keep emerging, right? And the description of violence and interesting point was that you also discussed the wife and the daughter, and that how it was different for the wife, the same violence that she had also witnessed, but how a lot of time we sideline, we do not see that they are also a victim of the same historical violence. And they also go through the same kind of impact or probably more long-lasting effects of the trauma on their psyche, right? So thank you very much. And I really enjoyed your talk. I believe I have a few things to say, but I think I would rather first take questions from the audience. There is something in the chat box. Okay, there are no questions. So we are open for question and answer session. If anybody has any questions from Tanvi, then please either you can just directly ask her. Would you like to? Yeah, is there someone?
No, Dr. Hara, please continue.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Manikaran. So maybe Tanvi, I can ask you to talk about the two. Usha has a question now, but maybe we can discuss the two madmans and then take Usha's question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah.
Her question is also on Lucian's Madman. So she's saying that I was also wondering about the striking similarity with Lucian's Madman, especially in the context of ancient practice of cannibalism and exploring the ancient ways of punishment. So maybe you can respond to that.
No? Yeah. This actually was very. I mean, it was very hard not to really comment on, especially the story, because the madman, and it's not just in the story where this ancient forms of punishment is referred to. Yu Hua, in another one of his stories, has also referred to the ancient forms of punishment. The story, The Past and the Punishments, where the punishment expert is an expert on ancient forms of punishment. So this knowledge, this obsession with ancient forms of punishment is can be seen in other stories as well. And in fact, some of the critics, Bai Chao has kind of like said that in a sense, Yu Hua is basically the most the right kind of like contemporary writer to inherit the legacy of Lu. And Yu Hua, in many of his stories, in fact, in his collection of a non-fiction work, which is China in 10 words, a collection of his essays on China. one of the essays titled Lucian, that he dedicates an entire essay on Lucian. So he gives a lot of importance to Lucian, and Lucian is I think is the only Chinese thinker that he really attributes influence, on his literary writings too. So I think there is the sense of kind of like kind of referring to another text, like sort of his intertextuality. And the madmen, although the madmen in this story and the madmen, Lucian's madmen are different. In different in the sense that both have got they find the in the ancient history books, they find the root cause of China's feudal whatever is wrong with Chinese society. They see the evils of Chinese society. They see it rooted in China's past. But in the story, Lucian's story, the madman, so to say, becomes better, and then he rejoins China, the society, in a sense. But here in this story, there's no way back for this madman. He's completely detached, or has completely is not in sync with reality at all. He wants to return to his reality. He wants to return to his family, and in the end, while he's mutilating himself, basically he inflicts the 5 ancient forms of punishment on himself. Chopping off his nose, cutting off his torso, and all of that. In one of his last breaths, he kind of has this moment of clarity where he remembers his wife, when he was in college, the first time he met, and he wants to go back home, but then he can't. So his delusions are different from the madman of Lucian. But the similarity is that they trace this violence that is inherent in modern day culture as well to the ancient in China. The kind of like violence is something that has been inherited over the period of time. So that is one thing which is common. But then the madman in Lucian's story goes back to the society, while this madman has completely been rejected by society. He's not. He's sort of like invisible. He's just something. He just becomes a spectacle. So I do see this, which is it's interesting. That's why I kind of like commented on it. The madmen are similar and different in both ways.
Yeah. Also, that this you talked about self-mutilation. So I think this madman is also inflicting pain on himself.
Yeah.
Other madman from Lucian's story is more, in the larger scheme of things, is kind of warning about the tendencies of the Chinese society, run, the nature, cannibalism,
Yeah.
right? So it is more, I think, outward looking, and here the madman is inflicting pain on himself, mutilating himself, right? Do you see anything else in through that how that madman was cannibalistic and this one was not cannibalistic but self-mutilating?
Yeah. So I agree that the madman in Lucian's story, the idea of run, but that's, I mean, he does it in the sense of like saying run, he makes it more more apparent that way. But Yu Hua and in fact most of the works of avant-garde writers, Yu Hua also, the violence is something that that human beings are inherently a part of. So the perpetrator of violence and the victim of violence are sometimes one and the same, and sometimes different. So human beings have become this, they've been caught in this cycle of violence. And that's what Yu Hua sees as something that is present all across, like not just ancient China, it's in ancient China. It wasn't during the the Mao period, but he sees that also continuing into the post revolutionary and post Mao period. And like he says how Chinese society moved from one extreme to the other extreme. So there was this stream of ideology, and then it moved to the other extreme of consumption, the consumer culture. So he sees violence in that as well. This apathy of human being is also violent. It's not just when you actually, so there's actual physical, violence carried out on body. But when he does it on himself, he feels in his mind he's doing it. It's part of the research when he kind of carries out those and he not just does it on himself, he's also in his mind doing it to other faceless individuals. And in a sense, some of the scholars have argued that how that violence or that, inflicting pain or inflicting violence is also violence on history, in a sense that he's also kind of, making sure that the history is also, is kind of like, receive that violence. So this history that is also become an object of violence is something that we see in one of his story, which is Passed on the Punishment, where, like this ancient forms of punishment is also carried out on particular dates. So time becomes the object of physical violence. So because it's avant-garde, so he goes a little, in a more experimental way. Like you said, Kafka, you said it gave him freedom of writing. So he realized that he could write anything, that there were no limitations. There was no one way of writing. So that kind of freed him. And so he experimented with form and with language and everything.
Okay, I did not realize I muted myself. Usha has another comment, on the same line, that it's also interesting. It has been analyzed that in Lucian's Madman, the predicament was to eat or to be eaten. In 1986, the madman is actually submitting himself to the act of eating, mutilation in this context. And in Lucian's Madman, he decides to join the madness of the society.
Yeah, I agree. So I mean, this choice, and even in the end, when it says that he gets better, so I mean, even right from the beginning, it's questionable whether he is insane. Maybe he's seeing things more clearly than any other sane person. In our context, the madman comes with, I mean, he hallucinates, of course, but he also is somebody who does not, who's out in the public. The madman in the initial story is kind of confined to his room. He's away from the public view. He sees things, then he's been hidden away from the public view. This madman in 1986 is hyper visible. By inflicting all these forms of punishment on his own body in public view. He's like right at the center of the town square where everybody can see him. His wife and his daughter can even see him through their house, through the window of their house. So he becomes hyper visible in that sense. So that kind of spectacle is something that I think this Madman 96 becomes that kind of a spectacle. And like he does not join the madness of society, like Nam is saying. Which is interesting.
Okay, if there are more questions, please come forward and ask. Otherwise, I have something more to ask Tanvi from. Okay, so we'll wait, Tanvi, while others take their time. I just wanted to ask you, there are a couple of things, just to understand that what made you choose this particular work or Yu Hua? Because I remember our conversation earlier on memory studies, right? So when it comes to Yu Hua, there are more famous works or works that are maybe widely read, such as Huoche, which are also based on memory, but they may not necessarily be on the lines of 1986, right? So when you read Huoche, the very first thing that comes out, and at different times sometimes you feel different things. So the very first time I read it, I thought it was about human suffering and the pursuit of life. The second time I read it, it would actually speak out of a lot of resilience, resilience of Chinese people, of Chinese civilization. So what made you choose such a writing instead of what Yu Hua, have been communicating, like through the works of To Live, Poacher, etc.?
Actually, I'm tracing the representation of memory, history, and trauma in his novels as well. So I'm doing that too. For the purpose of this presentation, I decided to choose his avant-garde writing and this work because I kind of Yu Hua's Huoche is it's I think, I mean, and I might be wrong, but it's one of those works that is so popular that almost everyone has read it. Like, I have met people who do not work on Chinese literature at all, and the only the only work that they've read of Chinese literature is Yu Hua's Hoja. So it's a very popular work for sure. So I mean, I've done that. I also analyze that. But the representation of memory and trauma is very different in his novels, and there's a significant shift in his works from his avant-garde works to his more realist mode of writing in 1990s. And he also talks about this shift in his writing, like why he changed, because that was one of the questions that he was like constantly asked, by most of the people who interviewed him, like why this sudden shift and why this change. So he's written about that. My interest was in Yu Hua, and that started with novels, but then also his avant-garde writing are very. I mean, it's hard not. I think that kind of starts the beginning of how he started this, this interrogation into memory and history. So when I'm working on when you're working on trauma, avant-garde writing becomes very significant, and the way memory is represented is different because there's this fragmentation of narrative. There's this unreliable narrative. When you see Yu Hua's Watcher, or you see Shishangan, Mai Shui, or you see Xiongti, you see this. There's this sort of like a story that goes. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it's like sort of like a story. It's a linear progression of the experiences of this one particular person. It's a life story. In his short story, it's not like that. The narration, the story is just, it's fragmented. There's no one single absolute truth that you can really find. Sometimes you can't even make sense of the story. But he became very popular with these stories because they looked at China's recent past in a very different way. So for me, that was very interesting. And most of the stories, if we see, in fact, 90 Days is one of my favorite stories of Yu Hua, and another one is Putia Aiching. But that is a parody of, of genre, of this old genre of novels, and not about, memory and history. So 1986 was very important. I thought it was because it speaks allegorically in multiple ways. History teacher, right? 1986. The year is significant. The story, the history teacher, and then he returns to a town, and then there are people around who do not see him, and the world has moved on. So this my interest in the idea of memory, and how it connects to forgetting. Like, what does it mean to remember, and what does it mean to forget? How are we ethically implicated in remembering our past? These kind of questions, sort of became very interesting when I read this story, emerged from this. I thought that doing one particular story, focusing, and I've analyzed other stories as well, part of my research, larger research. But I thought focusing on one particular story would be more, beneficial and maybe a little more interesting to go deep into one particular one story instead of talking about more than one. So my interest was, I in fact I enjoy actually. I'm a little biased towards Hua's side. I enjoy everything that he writes. In fact, his recent novel that came in 2021, One Song, a lot of people did not like, and that I talked to, who read Yu Hua, did not enjoy the recent novel that much. I love that as well. So I guess I'm a little biased towards his writing.
That always happens. Okay, there is another question by Sneha Sinha. She is thanking you for the talk, and she's saying, I was wondering if history and memory are interlinked. Would that entail that history is mostly subjective?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking the question. Yes, history and memory are interlinked, and a lot of scholars who work on history and work on memory studies, they identify the link between history and memory, and it's over a period of time. So, for example, when you see in ancient past, memory was a way of memory was seen as history, right? So people like remembered things and they wrote it down, and that became history. So what people remembered about what happened became the official history. And over a period of time, in modern times, history became more objective, history became more scientific. And so memory was seen as like, antithesis to history. Like, memory was subjective and history was objective. And history was something which was like unchallenged truth, and memory was something just that that was subjective to person, which was like fluid and But in the postmodern context, so when we see in postmodern context, history is seen like memory as a representation. It's also it is subjective. It is not set in stone. It changes with the one who tells the story, who tells the history. So if you are interested in this, in this connection between history and memory, and I'm not sure if you are, but if you are, there's a scholar, memory studies scholar called Alida Asman, who's written about memory and history specifically and its connections and its, the intellectual concept of history and memory together. So she's written about it a lot. I mean, if that helps. There are other scholars as well, and I'm very happy to give the names if you're just interested.
Okay, thank you, Tanvi. Tanvi, there are other avant-garde writers also, right? What I wanted to know was if you could tell us if you have read works of women writers, if you could tell us that how when they look at the traumatic past, how the expression or the narrative would change when it's a women writers or a man writer, for an example, if it changes at all. Do you see?
Yeah. So avant-garde writers, there are many others as well, and most of them they like Yu Hua, wrote in avant-garde manner in the 1980s when it was the heyday of avant-garde movement in China, and then they moved to different forms of writing. One of the most, I think, in avant-garde, among the avant-garde writers, the only female writer is Zhang Shui, and she's not just the only female writer, but she's also one of the first, the forerunners of avant-garde movement. And she also is older than other avant-garde writers. I think she's born in 1950 to 53 or something. So she's born before them. But she and Ma Yuan, also a little older than the other, these two are considered to be the first ones to to kind of launch this kind of writing. So Han Shui's writing is similar and a little different. I've read a little bit, and to my understanding, and I've read scholars write about Han Shui and talk about her works. In her works, it's more of this sort of like surrealistic way of describing things, or like this more of stream of consciousness, where just like one person's imaginations running around, like not a coherent plot. In Yu Hua's works also there's no coherent plot, but then you see things happening. In Zhang Shui's works, it's more of like stream of consciousness, just like one person's imaginations of things. Things are real, but they're not real, something like that. So Zhang Shui in that sense is very different from other writers. Like for example, one of the male writer, Kafei, he writes more. His focus is more on history as well, like a little bit like Yu Hua and Su Tong, for example. They write more oriented towards history, and I think Zhang Shui's works are more, like said, like more inward, more like more individual and more like personalized, unlike the other male writers. So I think she's the only female writer among the avant-garde writers. The others are all male writers.
Yeah, there is a question. Sorry, I did not mean to cut you.
No. I was just thinking about how this one of writers with whom she's written in her book. She writes about the misogyny in the avant-garde writers, focusing on avant-garde writers and how these misogynist representations were perpetuated by these writers, and after the end of French Revolution, because they were kind of like in their process of kind of dismantling everything that was before the post-French Revolution period. They kind of like in maybe consciously or subconsciously, unconsciously, they kind of gave into misogynist and representations in their writing, because women are just mere objects, and a lot of violence is perpetrated on their bodies, something like that. And that just brought me interestingly how like if you don't see that in Zhang Shui's works, of course. So yeah, so I think she's the only female writer.
Okay. There's so much to discuss with you, but then there is Soumya Datta's question now. She's thanking you for the talk, and Her question is, how does Yu Hua play with language through repetition, omission, and absurdity? Highlight the failure of language to articulate individual experience in a society recovering from ideological saturation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question.
Linguistic features, yeah, it's good for everyone who's learning the language too.
Yeah. So thank you so much. So this playful attitude towards not just history but also language. So this linguistic what they call and if you have read a little about if you know a little bit about Russian formalism or there's this concept of like linguistic estrangement or linguistic deviation. So the words are supposed to mean something, they don't mean exactly that. Or like you said, it's not really repetition or omission, but maybe like the absurd, the representation of the absurd. So so nothing in the story when he writes is familiar, right? So when you read, like like for example, the example I gave that the willow tree, the willow branches, over the river resembles clumps of so something like that. So the imagery or something that is very culturally viable for somebody, for us or like somebody who lives in China who's Chinese, becomes completely different. It's completely deviated. So that's something that he does with language, and which is something which everybody, all of the avant-garde writers, they do. So there, so when I say like trauma is also, some of the scholars have also done that, said that the trauma is also cultural, because the cultural trauma is the violence that is perpetrated on language, on the narrative modes. So for example, the writings that preceded this, and so avant-garde writers, they very consciously wanted to dismantle the kind of modes of representation, modes of writing that existed before them. So like the realist mode of writing, critical realism. So you write what you see, you write as it is, like the reality, and they don't do that. So they don't see the reality as it is. So they write it in a different way. So that kind of deviation, that kind of estrangement of language is what we see in Yu Hua. So so not with repetition, but definitely with absurdity and making things which are so like fantastical, things like something that or like horrors, like for example, a lot of violence is carried out. So like imagine like for example this history teacher, like very in a very cool manner, it's just like talking about how he chops his nose off, which is something of course would not really happen in reality, but that by talking about it, you're like you're creating a reality that is not real. So something like that. And also with language, this is my understanding that one way that he also kind of plays with language is and he kind of perpetuates cultural violence is by kind of not giving names to his characters. So like we all remember Yu Hua, and we all remember Fu Shukui, right? We all remember Shi San Quan, we all remember Shi Yilan. These characters become like like we know them, but none of his avant-garde stories have the characters have names. So he's like history teacher or a madman, his wife. There are no names. In one of his short stories, all the characters have just numbers, like 4 who lives in this, and whose son, or the number 3 or number 2 or number 1. So just given names. So this kind of robbing characters of their name is kind of robbing of a sense of identity. Also, is kind of like a cultural violence that is perpetrated. So we don't really know who we're talking about that way. So I'm not sure to the question, but thank you so much for the question. And please reach out to me if you, if any other question, and maybe I'll get back to you with more information and with a better answer.
No, I think that was a very good answer. If there are more questions, we'll give it another minute. Okay.
I just, since we're talking, Yu Hua and Wang Ani, they did a talk together, And it just kind of like made me think about like, like both of them, I mean, had this, and I kind of saw that entire talk. So both of them talked, about literature, contemporary writing, and also, the role of AI and how it's going to affect, our writing in general. So it's very interesting.
Okay, when was this talk?
I think last year, 2 years back, something. It's available on. I saw it on the thing, but it just happened before I went to Shanghai, so I kind of missed it.
Okay, okay. Okay, I think, Tanvi, there are no more questions. Yeah, there is nothing in the chat box. Okay, then if it is okay, then maybe we can end the talk here. So, Tanvi, thank you so much for speaking to us today. And it was wonderfully delivered. And I'm very happy with the variety of questions that came your way, and you answered all of them very well. So thank you once again for enlightening us with this one short story by Yu Hua, and wish
Thank
you
you.
all the best for your thesis.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm learning from you and from everybody. So I hope I take a lot of inspiration from you and Usha ma'am and everybody. So
Patricia ma'am has commented, excellent talk. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking time out.
Patricia ma'am also has written, thank you, Tanvi. It was so stimulating and inspiring.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
On
Thank
behalf
you, everyone.
of ICS, I thank Tanvi, and we can end the talk here. Manikaran?
With this, we come to an end to the end of the today's seminar. We thank Dr. Manjurani Hara and Ms. Tanvi Negi for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. We would like to invite you all to the upcoming 70th Giri Deshankar Memorial Lecture, which will be held on 8th July at the Kamla Devi Halls 1 and 2, India International Center, New Delhi. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for further updates. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.